How's it going, everyone? Today we will be discussing the senses. So we're going to learn how the sights, the smells, the sounds, the things we feel, the things we taste are processed within our bodies, and how our nervous system and our brain interprets all of those senses to get a sense of what our internal and external environments are like. In order for us to sense something, a stimulus needs to be picked up by one of our sensory receptors. And once that stimulus is making contact with that receptor, in many different ways, the visual, auditory, taste, things like that, it will form a graded potential in that receptor. And then if that stimulus is strong enough to bring that sensory neuron to threshold, well, then there's going to be a generation of that action potential, and the communication and the information about that stimulus is going to be sent to the brain, where it's integrated, and then we get a sense of what is going on. We have many different types of receptors in our bodies which pick up on different stimuli, and we'll go over each type of those receptors. So first we have mechanoreceptors, which are going to pick up on mechanical stimuli, including touch and vibration and stretching. But these aren't only located within our skin cells. We also have them inside of our bodies as well. For example, baroreceptors are a type of mechanoreceptor which pick up on blood pressure, and they're located in the heart, in our vessels such as the aorta and the carotid arteries. But they're going to pick up on the pressure that is generated by the blood, and then that information is going to be sent to the brain. Also, we have thermoreceptors located within our bodies, and this is going to give our brain a sense of the temperature both internally and externally. We also have photoreceptors located in our eyes that are going to pick up on the rays of light around us and then give our brain a sense of our external environment. Chemoreceptors are going to pick up on different chemicals within the body, and some are located on your tongue and in your nose to pick up different tastes and different smells, but some are located to pick up on other things in the body, such as the amount of oxygen in the blood, such as the amount of CO2, the pH within the blood. So there are a lot of different chemicals that the body needs to pick up on and to see their concentrations of in order to maintain homeostasis. Nociceptors are pain receptors, and we are going to discuss these a little bit further in the chapter, but they are going to pick up on different types of pain stimuli. Here we can see the different ways which senses are registered by sensory neurons, and we can see above, in this case, the receptor or the stimulus is being picked up by the dendrites or nerve endings in the sensory neuron. So here, these nerve endings are encapsulated to form a receptor on the end of the sensory neuron, and below we see those nerve endings just free, not encapsulated. But either way, a stimulus is going to come into contact with these receptors. It's going to create a receptor potential, which can then trigger an action potential down the sensory neuron, which is going to be delivered to the central nervous system and then interpreted and registered by the brain. We can also see that receptors do not need to be attached to sensory neurons. So down below, we have a separate receptor, a separate cell that's going to pick up on the stimuli and then release neurotransmitters in order to activate and in order to get an action potential generated from this sensory neuron. So once that stimulus occurs and those neurotransmitters are released, that's going to create a postsynaptic potential in this sensory neuron. And then once we reach threshold, that action potential and that information about the stimuli is sent to the central nervous system and interpreted by the brain. Receptive fields are going to be the area of sensory information picked up by a single sensory neuron. And these receptors of that sensory neuron have a certain field where they pick up different information about touch, about sight, about taste, about smell. And so these specific receptors, when they're activated by a stimuli, they are going to, translate that information to a single sensory neuron. And that sensory neuron, since information is coming from that specific neuron, it's going to help our brain determine the location of the stimuli or the type of stimuli. And so these receptive fields are basically a way for our minds to differentiate all the different sensory information that's coming in, because specific receptors and specific sensory neurons are going to translate that information to the brain depending on what's occurring. Different sensory neurons could have different receptive fields that overlap, and so you could see in the example in the figure that on the left-hand side we have a stimulus that is taking place, and it is not overlapping with the sensory neuron next to it. Its receptive fields are separate. So in the location of the stimulus, you are going to get those action potentials firing by the sensory neurons to let the brain know. But for example, you have different areas of your body that are more sensitive to touch, like your fingers. And so you're more likely in those areas of the body, the more sensitive areas, to have these overlapping receptive fields. So when you have a stimulus that does overlap with another sensory neuron's receptive field, not only are you going to get firing from the sensory neuron more direct with the stimulus, it could also trigger some action potentials in the neighboring or the close by sensory neurons because those receptive fields are overlapping. All of our different senses are going to be processed by different areas of the brain. So somatosensory, taste, sight, sound, smell. These all have their own areas of the brain which processes all this sensory information. And those sensory neurons are going to deliver those messages, and then they'll synapse with interneurons which deliver all of this information to different areas of the brain to get a sense of our internal and external environment. When we talk about sensory pathways, we have names for the different neurons that are going to be communicating information. So sensory neurons are going to be what's called first order neurons. So from the periphery to the central nervous system, those sensory neurons, those are first order neurons. Second order neurons are going to communicate from the spinal cord to the thalamus within the brain. We said that that area of the brain is going to pick up on a lot of our sensory information. And then a third order neuron is going to be one that communicates between the thalamus and the cerebral cortex. Our bodies basically code senses. So our sensory neurons are going to be able to send information to the brain about how intense a stimulus is, where that stimulus is locating, how long that stimulus is lasting for, based off this sensory coding. We are able to identify where a stimulus is coming from based on the different receptors that are activated in response. And the skin is a good place to talk about stimulus location. So we have many receptors located throughout the skin, which are going to pick up on different tactile sensations, but certain areas of the skin are more sensitive than others. So in a place like your back, for example, if you had a caliper with two ends and you applied pressure, it'd probably be very hard to differentiate where the two different ends of the caliper are, because those receptive fields are a lot bigger and it's harder to differentiate the two different ends. But in somewhere like your index finger, where you have high concentrations of receptors, you are going to be more sensitive and probably better able to pick up on the two ends of that caliper because of the sensitivity and the amount of receptors located on your index finger. And we could see that demonstrated down below, where areas such as your index finger, your lips, your toe have a little bit more ability to be able to differentiate between two different points, while areas like your back, your thigh, your arm, your calf, you'd be less likely to tell the location of those two different stimuli apart. Our bodies are also able to code for stimulus intensity by the amount of action potential sent by the sensory neuron. So for example, let's say that we have a sensory receptor that picks up on heat. So this thermoreceptor, if let's say you touch a warm object, something slightly warmer than your body temperature, well, that's going to, create a receptor potential, and a certain amount of action potentials would then be sent to the brain. But let's say now you touch a hot object, something that may even potentially cause burning, right? So that stimulus strength would be stronger, and that receptor potential, because of the strength of the stimulus, is going to be stronger. And so in order to translate that intensity of the stimuli, this hotter object, that sensory neurons is going to send more frequent action potentials to let the brain know, hey, this is a really hot object. And so the main take-home point here is that the greater the stimulus strength, the more action potentials that are sent by the sensory neuron. We are also going to get a sense of stimulus intensity by how many receptors are being activated. So I believe I used this example in an earlier lecture, but someone poking you really hard in one area or someone punching you really hard in the shoulder, well, that surface area and that strength and that force is going to activate more receptors throughout this part of the arm. So that stimulus intensity is going to be, coded through all these different sensory neurons and all their different receptive fields to translate to the brain that this is a more intense stimuli than, let's say, someone just poking you in one location on your shoulder. Instead of continuous communication, there can be an adaptation by sensory neurons and their receptors. So for an example, let's say you have a stimulus that occurs, that receptor potential is going to be translated into the form of many action potentials within that sensory neuron. And then once that stimulus stops, well then so stop the action potentials. But receptors can adapt to actually more of this on and off response, where instead of multiple action potentials, there is one or a couple to translate that, okay, the stimulus is occurring, and then another one to translate that the stimulus has stopped. And so in this example, we could see same exact stimulus, but now the receptor is only picking up on the original potential, the original stimulus in the beginning, which translates to a couple action potentials. And then once the stimulus stops, then a second message is delivered in order to let the brain know the stimulus has stopped occurring. We are able to pick up on a lot of different tactile sensations. So our skin is encapsulated with all these different receptors that pick up on touch, pressure, vibration, itch, tickle. And so in order to do that at the molecular level, receptors need to be activated in response to different stimuli. Let's take, for example, a Pacinian corpuscle, which is a receptor that picks up on different vibrations within the skin. So you could see here that the nerve endings of this sensory neuron are going to be encapsulated into this corpuscle, and that at rest, we're going to see that ion channels located within, that cell are going to be closed. But as soon as vibration occurs to that area of the skin, that's going to translate to this channel opening, and then cations are going to be able to move into the cell. And since these are positive ions entering the cell, well, that's going to lead to depolarization. And so that graded potential can then be translated to an action potential, which is going to tell the brain, hey, there is vibration occurring in this section of the body. We are also going to pick up on different thermal stimuli. So we have one set of thermoreceptors that are called cold receptors, and they are activated when we are touching objects between 10 degrees Celsius and 35 degrees Celsius. And then we also have warm receptors, which we have less of, but they pick up on temperatures between 30 degrees Celsius and 45 degrees Celsius. Noxious stimuli or painful stimuli is picked up by nociceptors throughout the body. And these receptors are going to send information to the brain about what damage can be potentially occurring throughout the body. And sometimes it's mechanical, sometimes it's temperature, and then sometimes it could be many different modalities or many different forms of pain. We have many different pain pathways throughout the body, and we talked about in the last lecture that we have reflexes that try to help us avoid pain. So in the example that was shown in that chapter, in this chapter, if you have a painful stimuli that's occurring, stepping on something or, touching a hot object, you have that quick reflex in order for your body to try to get itself away from danger, and that's why whenever, you have a painful stimuli, you automatically draw back because that is a reflex. The sensory neuron is communicating with interneurons within the spinal cord, which then are going to lead to your muscles contracting. And so that reflex, that pain pathway, is a system in place in order to try to help prevent you from causing any more damage to your body. Although pain reflexes may originally bypass the brain, that information is still going to be sent to different areas of the brain within milliseconds. And so what's going to happen is we pick up on that pain stimuli via nociceptors, and then those first order neurons are going to synapse with second order neurons and release substance P in order for that second order neuron to then send its action potential to different areas of the brain. And so again, the thalamus will take in a lot of sensory information and tell the primary somatosensory cortex where this pain's occurring and how intense the pain is. But information is also sent to other areas of the brain. And that's why when you get hurt, you will probably have this fight or flight response, and that's your hypothalamus reacting to this pain stimuli, increasing your heart rate, your blood pressure, etc., to deal with this painful stimulus. And then areas like the limbic system, so your emotions, and that's why sometimes when people get hurt, they get upset and they cry, because all this information is being processed by the different areas of your brain. So just because a reflex is occurring and that drawback may not have been to do with synapsing from your brain, well, that pain information is still being delivered to different areas within your brain. Referred pain is when the brain is picking up that damage or pain is occurring in a separate part of the body where that damage is actually occurring. And the reason for this is because that the first order neurons of two regions of the body happen to synapse at the same second order neuron. So the brain is interpreting that as pain occurring in one place when it's actually occurring in another. And that's why a lot of times when someone is having a heart attack, they tend to feel pain in their left arm because that synapse of that second order neuron is sending a message to the brain that that's where the pain's occurring. So here we have a map of referred pain, and you could just tell that, some certain internal pain is translated and sensed as pain occurring in other places of the body. We also have proprioceptors, which we talked a little bit about last time with muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs, but these proprioceptors are going to tell our brain information about the length changes that are occurring within muscle, the amount of force that is being produced by skeletal muscle tissue or groups, and the joint positions and the joint angles that are taking place during movement. That will conclude our lecture on sensory systems within our body. It'd probably be good just to go back and memorize the different types of receptors and how our nervous system codes for the different senses. It'd probably be good to know the difference between the first order neurons, the second order neurons, and the third order neurons, and basically how our nervous system encodes for all these senses that are occurring within our bodies and outside of our bodies. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you next video.